Bonjour à toutes et bonjour à tous. Nous allons commencer.
Hello, we're going to start this session on impact finance. It's quite a large title. And we'll have the opportunity during this session to hear from many different speakers, people who I'm going to introduce now. Eric PINON, who's beside me, who's the head of the French Association for Financial Management, the AFG, representing management companies at this roundtable. Daniel BIARNEIX, who's the president of the French Association of Company Treasurers, and the assistant CEO of Saint-Gobain. We also in charge of relations with rating agencies, which gives you specific legitimacy to talk about the question of standards and grading. Then we have Cécile CABANIS, who's with Tikeo Capital. She's been there for more than a year after a brilliant career at L'Oréal, Orange, and Danone, and she's on the investor side as Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the group. Then we have Thierry DÉAU, who is the CEO of Meridiam, which he founded, a fund that's dedicated to infrastructure, so they have a longer notion of time. And we also get the opinion of financiers and investors. Sabine MAUDERER, who's a member of the executive board of the Deutsche Bundesbank. Welcome. This is your first time at X, and we're delighted to have you here. You're especially in charge of human resources and markets, and you're vice president and soon to be president of the Association of Central Banks and Supervisors, NGFS, Network for Greening of the Financial System. So we'll be talking about greening the financial system. And as is the tradition at the Rencontres, we have an economist, Céline GIMET, who's the professor of economics and international finance at the Institut d'études politiques in Aix-en-Provence. She's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and she's going to be presenting the topic. Céline. Thank you. As you saw in the previous sessions, companies with their investment strategies have an essential role in production methods. And in this session, we're going to really put a focus on the role of investors who have a determining impact on the orientation of practices in the companies that they work in and the companies they finance. So let's talk about impact financing as a real approach on behalf of the investors with a social and environmental positive social and environmental contribution that is direct and measurable in the investment decision made by the company. So to differentiate it from socially responsible investment in the framework of impact investment, environmental and social impacts are a priority with respect to financial profitability. So the main stake and the main difficulty is the fact that we're in a long-term dynamics. So impact investment impacts all sectors. It started in North America in the end of the 20th century, and then it spread after the big financial crisis. So in this panel, we'll start with motivation, and then the definition and the measurement of impact objectives, and then the coordination of different initiatives at a global scale. For motivations, in addition to philanthropy, reputation, each investment decision is linked to a profitability objective, and within the framework of impact investing, beyond the financial reasoning, we're going to integrate an environmental and social dimension that will make it possible to better estimate global risk and a more efficient allocation of resources and better measurement of risk and yield, which will not only be financial, but will also include extra financial yield or return. So studies show that the financial return of an impact investment is roughly equivalent to a traditional investments yield, but the social impact in terms of global well-being in the long term was much higher. So it would seem that the extra financial performance is really boosting financial performance. These assets have real success on financial markets now, as is shown by the recent issuance of green bonds at a European level. Beyond profitability, we need to talk about incentives and the responsibility of companies. The pursuit of the objective of social and environmental stability can be considered as a public good. Each individual can benefit at the same level and at the same time. The state hence has a role to play, and yet it can't centralize the production of this good. So it must create the conditions so that companies integrate a collective interest, the collective interest in their investment strategy. And for this, they have different tools, such as different types of incentive and regulations. So public policy is linked to this. And we can talk about initiatives that are in this dynamic, such as the European Action Plan for Sustainable Financing in 2018. The second question, a very important one, is the question of the definition and the measurement of objectives and impact for two reasons. The first, to be able to measure extra financial returns, and also to avoid greenwashing strategies and SSE greenwashing. So this means that we have to have clear and transparent criteria. This mission is particularly difficult due to the multidimensional nature of the impact. So today, researchers and international institutions are working on this topic. There also exists common reference guide with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and the Paris Agreement, but this must be accompanied by other objectives to take into account the specific nature of each sector. And this is where the third question comes into play, that of cooperation and coordination between the different actors, private and public, at the national, regional, and international scales. Firstly, in the definition of objectives, but also criteria, norms, and rules to accompany this, support this. And it must be noted that the fact that the European Central Bank is addressing the question of green monetary policy, this will certainly accelerate this movement. But also, these initiatives can't just be concentrated in some countries of the world, but must really be disseminated across the economies of the planet. So all of these points will be debated within the framework of this session, where we call on different actors from the economic world of today to talk about the systemic nature of the reality of impact investments. Thank you, Céline. Thank you, Céline. I'm going to hand the floor to Sabine MAUDERER, who's a member of the board of the Deutsche Bundesbank and is working on the greening of finance with the greening of the financial system. So what is required? Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to talk and to participate in this panel. Je suis ravie de...
As you know, that's a little bit easier for me. So I'm representing here the public sector. And therefore, I would start with, really, first of all, define what does actually impact investing mean. I'm a little bit concerned that we focus on little niche, on ESG labeling, on, certain impact investing. I would like to go a step beyond and really ask, why are we doing that? Why should we care about that? And the major thing why we should care about is because the whole economy needs to be transformed. So what we really need to do, and be it France, be it Germany, be it the whole world globally, the real economy, all kind of industries, need to be transformed. And this is for France, this is for my country, for a lot of other developed countries, crucial, because our wealth, our GDP depends on carbon incentive industry. Let's face it, right? So the question is really, you know, how can we enable the transition of those industries? You know, the money for those companies or startups which, you know, develop green technologies, I do not have any concerns that they get enough money, because this is the future, right? So of course it's great that we have financing this, but let's now maybe today also take into account that we really have to find a solution how we finance, you know, the backbone of our industries, and meanwhile incentivizing them to start the journey from maybe carbon incentive to amber to yellow to green at some point. This will take time, right? So having said that, what is the role of the public sector? And I mean, Céline touched it, and you, Nicolas, as well. And you know, what is the role of the private sector? We really have to define our roles. And let me start with the public sector, because I'm representing it today here. Let's look at the numbers. What are the volumes we are talking about? And let me just give you two numbers which are really representative and showing, you know, what an elephant in the room it is. Only to switch the energy system in the European Union, we'll need each year an additional 350 billion a year within the European Union, only to switch the energy systems, not talking about the whole transformation. Another number which is more shocking is, you know, if you have a global view, then the International Energy Agency, IRENA, estimates that we need each year $5.8 trillion to finance the transition. So these numbers show us that this is not manageable by the public sector, and it wouldn't be good, you know, because we have a lot of other things to do, as we see now. So it's definitely we have to share. If you know, I'm often asking, so how much of those numbers need to be financed by the public, and how much is left for the private sector? Let me put it that way. In the developed world, the really big part needs to be financed by the private sector, and we have a lot of experts from the private sector. They explain how they're going to do that. And you know, just to give you a little idea of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates, for example, for Ireland, that 1/3 needs to be financed by the public sector and 2/3 by the private sector. And I think, you know, I do not have other numbers, but I think we will see over the years, you know, comparable numbers. In the developing world, I would say that the role of the public sector is much bigger than in this private sector, because, you know, there's a lack of access to finance. And here in our hemisphere, it's much, the private sector plays a much bigger role. So let's come then to the private sector. It's often, you know, when I talk about impact investment, it's all about, you know, a lot of about capital market, what is right. But the truth is that in Europe, you know, in France and also in Germany, we are bank-based. You know, the real economy is bank-based. What does that mean? That means that we really have to see what role will the banking sector play or can play in the future to finance their customers in the future. Because, you know, as I said, most of them are very carbon incentive. And just to give you an idea how dependent our banks are from carbon incentive economy, yesterday the European Central Bank published the results of the stress testing of the banks, right? And the outcome was that 2/3 of the income of the tested European banks stem from very carbon incentive companies, you know, and only 20%. Oh, I have to come to an end, I see. So sorry, but then I maybe just a quick round. I have a second chance. Let me finalize by banks in Europe we have to take care of, and maybe just one thing I would really recommend is banks will play a major role, but they have to be careful because we have to set an incentive for their clients and for the real economy. So my proposal is that we ask the real economy, the companies, the corporates, for a transition plan. Because, you know, if we lend money to those companies, we really have to make sure that they do have a strategy to get to net zero over the next decades. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Sabine.
Just a word. Keep the microphone, please, Sabine. Yeah, one question for you. The figures you gave.
Il y a une chance de les atteindre.
Do you think we'll manage to achieve this target?
You mean that? The volume. This is a clear estimation, and I mean, usually it's not the question that we do not have money around. The liquidity is high, right? Also due to monetary policy. But you know, what we didn't manage so far to switch our investments into the sustainable finance. This switch is needed.
OK, merci beaucoup. Thierry Déaut, vous avez...
Thank you very much, Thierry Déaut. You've understood by listening to Sabine that a lot of the effort relies on the shoulders of the private sector. Let me be reminded that you manage a fund that works on infrastructures in the long run, and you're the president of Finance for Tomorrow. What is Finance for Tomorrow? Finance for Tomorrow is the branch of Paris Europlace that works on sustainable finance. And since we're talking about impactful finance, I must say that it's a reality today, but it's not at the right level. And this is what Sabine underlined or highlighted. How do we move from an impactful financial to a level of transformation of the economy so that we mobilize greater levels, greater means than today? That's why last year Finance for Tomorrow launched, with the support of the Ministry of the Economy, Olivier Grégoire in particular, a work group that the minister co-financed so that we ensure the convergence of definitions. There were a lot of debates on the actual definitions. So in the definition that was adopted by the Place de Paris, there was no priority given to extra financial elements. So I correct the definition of our economist as seen from the Place de Paris, but it's at the same time. You know, Emmanuel Macron's at the same time. It's looking for profit, but it's also looking to transform with a strong intention, but with a strong additionality, the world and the economy. How can this be distinguished with the pure ESG as it is often stated? Well, ESG, it's the basis. ESG is the basis. If you look at the SFDR European regulations at Article 8, you're doing ESG. Not too many acronyms, you know, because we don't have all specialists in the room. So avoid acronyms. So it's the European directive that regulates over the regulates the investment funds and asset managers, and that asks them to show more transparency in terms of social governance, and the ESG is a 10-year-old concept. You know, it's the minimum. When you're doing ESG, you do nothing else. So you need to be attentive, you need to be able to measure, and you need to have clear objectives that are measurable. It's important not to infuse financial impact with philanthropy. Philanthropy has a priority which is extra financial. Impactful finance has two priorities. To ensure the sustainability of the finance, it has to make profit, because the finance that doesn't make profit is not sustainable. And at the same time, it should be able to supply the addition of the social aspects and environmental subjects. But you need to make it to be able to choose. You're not doing everything at the same time. The universal framework like SDG or others do not enable to position oneself. But I'll talk about the Meridian practical example as Today, Meridiam, which manages about 18 billion euros in sustainable infrastructures, has also transformed itself in an addition enterprise because it enabled us to be clearly positioned on the impactful investment, long-term impactful investment. We invest on 25-year terms, but we define strategic axis with the intention, because we have 3-year objectives, to improve over 5 strategic axes. The first being the climate, because we have the capacity to measure the temperature of our portfolios and measure the lining up with the Paris Agreement, so ensure that we have portfolios that have an emission of to the level of 1.5 degrees. We have other axes such as socio-economic axis, access to public service, inclusion, or biodiversity. For this, you need to have the right methodologies to enable measurement, and that's the responsibility of the work group, to have methodologies to qualify. It's a big topic, you know. We'll talk a lot. We'll address this during this roundtable. So where do you stand now? You're systematically in the lower range of the temperature. Well, we have ecological transition funds that are under the 1.5 degrees threshold, but we have older funds that we are currently transforming, which are at 2.5 degrees. But for this, we need to continue work, and that's what the interest of a long-term investor is, the capacity to transform your assets to lower the carbon footprint. And so you talked about the access to the public services, but well, I understand the impact on the political standpoint as far as the development of the economy, but I have problems understanding that at the financial level. Finance benefits from that. If I'm capable of serving millions of people by supplying an everyday mobility service to let them go to work, well, people win out of this. They're winners. But the socio-economic impact is enormous. Can it be measured? Yes, absolutely. Take the example of the RATP Paris transport. It's measured every day. How many passengers does it serve every day? We know that by financing the Greater Paris at the level of 40 billion, we know the impact it will have on the access to public transport for the Paris region. Strike days, number of strike days. No comment on that. Cécile CABANIS. You're the Deputy Director General of Tikehau Capital. What does the Tikehau Capital do in this field of impactful finance? Maybe before that, I would share with you my vision, because I think you've lost the audience. You know, they're talking about the ESG, the impact, the regulations, the measures, and everything. I think it's finally boils down to something that's very simple. To be profitable, you have to be sustainable. To be sustainable, you have to be profitable. But simply, I think we capture natural human financial resources, and to ensure the sustainability of the system, they have to be restituted with value. Otherwise, the system just stops, blocks. In fact, the ESG, I don't like this word because it's used not in the right fashion, but I think there's the right to operate. I think that everybody should have a minimum capacity to operate, because since we'll have more and more regulations and people will become more and more rigorous as far as the enterprises, I think we'll need to be sure that at a given point we continue to attract the youth in the enterprises, that we continue to have customers and investors. That's the basis. And we have to look at the extra financial aspects in the same way. The problem with the extra financial aspects is we created a lot of indexes, very complicated. The methodologies are not yet finalized, and it's an additional problem. But it's the basis. To do so today, and I will go back on the impact and how we can help speed up and put up the scale. Today, enterprises, well, we've asked them to do this, but they haven't changed their work methods, their governance, and they haven't changed their time horizon. So, in fact, today, everything that is boils down to transformation is a cost. And because you're looking at your short-term horizons with the financial measuring, without measuring externalities, and we know the transformation is in the long run, so the value depending on the transformation will take place in between 5, 10 and 15 years. We have a problem there, which is yet not solved for enterprises. And the other topic is that we were raised to be very competitive and individualistic in the way we manage our business models, because each of us is on part of the value chain. A segment. I work in my little garden, in my, but the planet doesn't work that way. It's not because each and every one will have his own or her own universe that we will manage. We're responsible for the system in which we are, all responsible. We know we're not going fast enough. And so yesterday we're talking about the inactivity triangle between the public authorities, the private sector, and individuals. We can add some schizophrenia between the citizen and the consumer. And this goes back to the topic of sobriety, or for those who prefer the psychoanalysis, in the drama triangle, the savior, the victim, and so on. So we have to pull out of this triangle. So DÉAU Capital was set up by 2 entrepreneurs in 2004 who started from scratch, and 18 years later they have 35 billion of assets under management on 4 assets, real estate, private debt, investment capital, and capital markets. And our mission is to take the world's savings and to put it to work in the real economy. When you do that, at the same time you have a responsibility, but there's also a great opportunity to bring the investment where we can make the system and transform it in a more resilient fashion. So I agree with what Sabine was saying. They're not the good and the bad. The system is as it is. We need to transform it. New technologies, great, okay, they're fine, but when the IPCC says we have 3 years to reach the peak of emissions, we have to train the mass of assets to do so. So the way we do it, all the barriers as asset management, we can propose solutions either for investments or financing that will break the barriers or remove the hurdles. So we have a decarbonization fund, and so we look at the whole value chain. We're not, in a corner of the value chain. We consider the entire value chain, and we accompany the enterprise that enables transition time, and we've set objectives that are simple and clear and that we convey to our investors on a regular basis with an assessment or independent assessment. And so now we're tackling agriculture, same thing. We set up a fund, a 15-year fund. We know agriculture is on the long term. We're not interested in the topics of the niche topics, like I produce meat from I don't know what in my garage. No, we're on the land, the soil. 95% of the food needs come from the soil, and we've degraded 50%. Tomorrow, we'll eat things that come from the soil. It'd be very important in the future to regenerate the soils. It's not who's going to pay the matter. It's a question of time horizon and investment. The UN are saying, well, I invest $1 in the soil. At the end of the cycle, I collect between 8 to 30. So it's not the idea of arbitration, knowing who's responsible. The idea is to make progress and propose actions. We're lucky enough to be managed by entrepreneurs. One of our mottos is that we create, we don't compete, quote unquote, and our role is to propose this and to debug the whole chain. And when we can create a fund, we attract other investors, whether public or private, and we can put this up to scale, because you demultiply the investments from the start. And DÉAU Capital always puts its balance sheet to work through its management, and it continuously invests its own money to align the interests. We have to create this collective action, and that's what we try to do. So I'll hand over the floor to corporate managers, the emitters, those who try to levy funds to finance their growth. You're the president of the powerful French Association of Enterprise Treasurers, Corporate Treasurers. You're directly impacted by all this gigantic transformation, but for the French Association of Corporate Treasurers, things are not that clear, crystal clear. There are a lot of unknowns that you need to clarify. So, hello everybody. Impactful finance is a dialogue on social, environmental stakes between the world of companies and the society. So the treasurer in our association, well, these reflections are essential. I'd like to share them around 3 topics: the principles, the data, and the tools. As far as the principles, we will all agree that the objective is to entrain as many enterprises as possible in an active and ambitious approach that is consistent with the environmental and social objectives of all our economic world. Contrarily, the objective is not, on the basis of static data up to date, to exclude some sectors or condemn them to disappear. For us, what's important is that in the impactful finance, the principles be based on an incitative approach, inclusive approach, and dynamic approach, by opposition to what would be an exclusive and static penalty-oriented strategy. The second point is on data. If we want to steer clear from illusions and make sure that we are in reality, we need to measure. And to measure, we need to have indicators, data that are transparent and reliable. So obviously, for corporations, these indicators need to be shared by all, otherwise we'll have a different response, meaningless. And for moderators that are called to define these indicators, we suggest that they take the indicators that are as simple as possible and in the smallest number. It's good for enterprises, otherwise they will just waste their time, especially SMEs, to understand these indicators. And this is good for investors, otherwise they will just be dispersed over different indicators. And the second thing is these indicators and this data, well, we need to use it to assess it. Our companies, to assess the corporation, are they on the right trajectory? And the ESMA, which is the regulator of financial markets, has published this week conclusions on a study it did with different European financial places, and we have an objective that we share, is that this capacity to assess the data is not mature enough, going in all directions. The methodologies are not clear, and so we're considering that this ecosystem, assessment ecosystem, which includes the social and environment aspect, follow the same process the credit notation, is that we head for methodologies that are transparent, that are controllable, and that can be verified. Last point, financial tools. We have traditionally 2 main financing tools, either the finance that is dedicated to specific projects. I want to build a wind farm. I want to do finance research to modify my production methods. Since this project is consistent with the environmental and social needs, I endorse a financing. And the second financing is aimed at financing all the activities of an enterprise, but where the enterprise is committed to its strategy and to reach the objectives. And we can also imagine other tools. What's important is that the palette of financial tools available to companies be as wide as possible to cover all their needs, and that it enables them to accompany them in all their transformation phases. It's also interesting for investors to have a diversity of products on which they can invest. So, in a nutshell, if the impactful finance has inclusive, incitative, and inclusive principles, if it relies on simple, transparent methods with transparent valuation methods, and if you propose a palette of financing that's broad enough to cover all the different needs of enterprises, there's no reason that it doesn't lead to reality. Thank you.
À vous demander. Vous disiez...
I have a few questions for you. You said today we need inclusive and not punitive measures. So do you feel that what you're obliged to align on in terms of the market is punitive, mostly, today? Not really, but we feel that there could be a trend in this direction. We have a drift towards taxonomy with a static analysis without looking at the projection. So there is a potential danger in the future. So in a company like Saint-Gobain, when you fill in your nomenclature, that allows you to have your impact or ESG rating, how much data is required? Normally, I don't talk about Saint-Gobain, I only talk about the association. The criteria that it has to provide information about roughly 100 indicators. It's incredible. And we have to, when we do our financial reporting, we have to give information on each subsidiary. When we give ESG data, it's not each subsidiary, it's each site. So this is something that is a much higher in terms of volume. So it takes several dozen indicators per site. It's very complicated. So the honorary president of the French Association of Financial Management, in this roundtable discussion, you're also representing savers, the companies who work for savings. So banks will have to ask all of their customers if they want the saving investors, if they want the ESG impact to be taken into account or not. Hello, everyone. I'm lucky enough on this panel to be speaking with some of my members, Tikio and Meridiam. The question that's asked, and that will be asked to clients in the beginning of August to be very transparent, we're going to, it might be a little bit later than that, but the question is, do you want further ESG investment? So I'd like to come back onto the title of our round table, Impact Finance, Illusions and Realities. And it is illusions and realities. I think illusions, we're in a conversion phase, as was said, in a phase that takes some time, in a long-term phase. So when we're lucky enough to have long-term investors, we have the time to implement measures. When we have customers, mass market retail customers, basic customers, the demand is for more short-term positions. And the question that's going to be raised at the beginning of the summer, in August, it is already the summer now, we're going to have to deal with the topic of showing that it has become a reality and it's not just an illusion, impact finance. We've talked about the Green Deal, a regulatory framework that's been talked about for companies, that's valid for us also. All of this is important. Sustainable finance has only just accelerated awareness of environmental, social, and governance stakes. We've had a lot of objectives. The first that I'm proud of is the SDGs from the United Nations. And it's an important topic for many of us. After the Paris agreements, the famous COP21 that's been mentioned several times since yesterday, is that financial actors now have to provide responses at the level of our customers' demands. We have a lot of customers who are institutional ones, with long capital, as we call it, but we also have private short-term, long-term investors. That was said in the previous roundtable discussion. We have a problem with allocation of assets, and you know that I'm very focused on education and long-term investment. We'll have credible long-term investment if the illusion is it turned into a reality, looking for ecological, social performance and financial profitability, as Thierry said, and as everyone else said here. There's impact financing, and taking into account this reality, finance plus other objectives is important. People ask for it. Younger generations, and our friend Lorenzi says this every time, that we're here with young people. Young people want us to be close to the money that they're investing, and they want us to have the right objectives. So for the AFG and its members, we want to produce results that are perhaps too modest for now, and at this point they're insufficiently known, but there is a real development objective to answer our question that will be raised in August. Let me just finish. I thought you were going to ask me a question. I think it's important, and I really would like to stress this. It was said by my neighbor, there will only be solutions to the management of third-party accounts that we do if there is a sharing of information. We don't have in the description that was done on companies and their sites, etc. If we can't agree on the rules, and if we can't agree on all of the rules, this is going to be problematic. Thierry DÉAU talked about this, and we were lucky to have Michael Bloomberg at the COP meeting in Ireland. The work that we've done together, and Financial Tomorrow has published some results. We're currently growing the action of Finance for Tomorrow with a project that's going to be called the Institute of Sustainable Finance. So this is for us to go further, and I'll stop here. The topic of the labeling, the topic of referencing. Today we have European problems. There's no European label. Without going into the technical details, a management company has to work with the French, Belgium, German labels or qualifications to be considered sustainable or impactful. And I think that we need to work in this direction for complete transparency between the actors, the issuers, the investors working for our saving investors, so that things will be simpler in the future. Thank you, Eric. I have questions linked to the context. Having a general and generous vision of impact financing and the responsibility that we can have for the future, this is great, but there's a complicated present right now with the war in Ukraine. Do you, as investors, does the Bundesbank, for instance, has it integrated into its requirements of the time, of the day, the fact that it was difficult to finance things, difficult weapons industry? The head of Thalys would say, I cannot get financing at the same cost as my competitors in other sectors. Have you integrated this? Do you accept now to change your criteria on coal? In Germany, that's a considerable topic, and the financing of coal-fired power plants. Just in a weapons, since we've had a lot of exclusions in our jargon, and we have understood that the rules can't be too strict, but the reality is that there's a major effect, and the general direction of weaponry has content us to continue to finance them. Thales is clearly saying that American companies are financed at a much lower level than we're being financed at. Thierry DÉAU, Sabine MAUDERER. I think that this current crisis has removed dogma in terms of the topic of transition. We say that there's a crisis, we need to respond, we need to accelerate transition, we need to accelerate the independence from Russian gas. Weapons, that's another topic. But when we consider these investments that are not very green as transition investments, and if we turn to the COP21 and AEIE reports, coal, nuclear energy, gas, all have a role to play, but at a certain time we have to detox from these energies. Does the pace have to change? Yes. We're asking for acceleration, but does the context since February 24th mean that there are other absolute emergencies? The absolute urgency is next winter now. Yes, we need to find gas to replace Russian gas. Germany has to go back to coal-fired plants because they stopped their nuclear industry. We can talk about the relevance.
If you allow, so... Yeah, actually, maybe for us, I mean, we are more dependent in Germany than you were on Russian gas, 17% versus 40%. There's a little bit of a difference, but I think we are in the same boat. And let me just, the day when we had the invasion, I mean, everybody was shocked and we thought, okay, now we have other concerns than climate. But, you know, after a couple of weeks, everybody understood that we need to get our independence back. Everybody is talking about energy security, right? In my country, even more than here, but I'm pretty sure that will come here as well. And so for us now, the terms is energy security means sovereignty, independency, and means accelerating the transformation even for us, right? So, and you're absolutely right. We have to be pragmatic, right? We have to get, unfortunately, back to coal and others sources we thought we get rid of. But, you know, this does not mean that we see lock-in effects, because at the same time we accelerate the investment process in renewables. Just to give you an example, what we just decided in my country is that by 2030, 80% of our electricity has to come from renewables. I mean, this is this is pretty fascinating if we really, you know, have to do that. And maybe getting back to France, right? I mean, 70% of the energy is coming, or electricity is coming from nuclear. And, well, a lot of plants need to be refurbished, and as far as I understood, before 2035, you want to reduce your share on nuclear to 50%, and you want also to accelerate, you know, the process of renewables. So I think within the European Union, a lot of countries are in the same boat, and therefore, you know, it's even now a wake-up call that we have to accelerate the process.
Ok. Cécile, sur ce même sujet, est-ce que vous...
Cécile, do you have an opinion on this same topic? Has the time scale changed or the scope? No, I think that we need to know how to adapt. The Ukraine crisis in terms of farming, defense, energy has got everyone to converge on the same objective, but you have to keep focusing on the objective and work on our trajectories. We must take into account the context and not try to avoid it. We're going to have to navigate with tacking back and forth, but we still need to speed up. Any questions in the room? In the first row? Please stand up. Yesterday, there was a conference with the governor of the French Central Bank. He talked about how, I'm talking to the investors, are you prepared to reduce rates? I didn't hear his question properly, I apologize. I think that we're talking about reducing profitability. If we don't understand that that transition is an investment, we have to talk about a longer term. If you're a listed company, you have a topic for investment because you're graded on the short term. Today, we're not measuring externalities. We're not taking into account cost or value. So we need that investors find the means to support the cycle, but we'll get our return on our investment. We have to be profitable. We have to continue to invest in the system, and we have to have a system with value. The topic of continuing to convince people that we have to bring our margins down is not the right topic. We have to change the way we operate, and our functioning. We're incremental because we said to people, do what you were doing in the past, but on top of that, you add another element that you can't measure. Danielle, I won't comment on the requirements of profitability for capital investment, and I completely respect what the governor has said. But for companies, and I'll come back to what was said previously, there's no opposition between the environmental, social, and governance objectives and financial objectives of companies. Companies are aware that in order to have a sustainable strategy in the long term, they must both manage the financial objectives and their environmental and social objectives. Then we can talk about the way we're dealing with short-term investments, but the commitments go together and will create value if we manage them properly. Thierry? I say that I agree there's no opposition, and the governor was maybe talking about the short-term liquidity markets, but when we're investing in transition, we don't have a choice. Investing in non-transition is investing in stranded assets, assets that will no longer have any value in 15 or 20 years. So if you're an investor and you have durability in front of you, the question of profitability is not on the table. So quickly, please. We have very little time, so we're not trying to... I have a simple question. We have a ESG score on big companies, but what about SMEs? They represent 80% of our economy. Eric, that was talked about. It's a real topic today. It costs a lot of money for small companies, especially for extra financial assets. So for right now, they're excluded, and we want them to deal with simple processes, as my neighbor said.
Vous êtes britannique ou anglais? Vous parlez français?
Oui, je parle français, mais
voilà,
je m'adresse à Madame Mauderer.
Oui,
Sehr
oui.
angenehm.
For Mrs. Mauderer, I just wanted to say a few words about banks. We didn't hear much about banks on this panel. I'm from BNP Paribas, and I just wanted to say that, of course, banks are very committed to the energy transition and in the financing of our customers to this end. I wanted to have a comment from Mrs. Mauderer about the way in which the central bank sees the evolution. You talked to Madam about climate stress tests that were published yesterday with worrisome figures. 2/3 of the revenues are based in carbon-intensive industry, and I wanted to know what you include in that. Is it corporate? Does it include real estate or other portfolios? So,
go into the details, but maybe in the interest of all of you. So banks play a major role, and the bigger ones are certainly on their way, but we are always coming from a risk approach. So what we ask the banks and also the smaller banks, right, is be aware of the climate risk you have on your balance sheets. And that means that they have to know their customers, their SMEs and so on. So actually, maybe give it back to the banking sector. The banking sector in France and in Germany play a major role because they reach out to the SMEs, to the small and medium companies, and they have really to be the translator of what is needed. What, you know, small and medium-sized companies often even don't know what we expect them to do and what will be on the long run at the table. And therefore banks are really, you know, play a major role in translating and explaining what in the future with this companies will need.
Sabine. Juste un mot et un défi. Céline.
Just one comment on the very relevant comment made by this lady when I talked about impact financing as a place for dialogue between companies in the financial sector. Of course, in the financial sector, we have investors and banks, and that's very important for SMEs. The tradition is that the Cercle des Économiques concludes, a word to conclude, we all agree today that we must take into account social and environmental impact, profitability and sustainability are objectives that can be compatible for impact investment to participate in the next wave of innovation and in the next growth cycle that will be more green and more sustainable. All of the actors must be involved, and we need to clearly define measures and indicators. So applaud, this was the best roundtable of the morning.